Good evening, bonsoir mesdames et messieurs, en vos titres et fonctions, chers collègues, chères étudiantes et étudiants, chers amis, bonne soirée, bienvenue à l'Institut et à la Maison de la Paix. I'm particularly delighted to welcome you tonight for this launch of the Geneva Policy Outlook. I even did 7 hours of train in one single day to be sure that I would not miss that. And as Hakim said, it was good that it was not French trains today, because I probably wouldn't have been here tonight. Until last December, the Geneva Policy Outlook was a process. Now it is a process and an output. And I will let Hakim and several co-authors explain to you in greater detail what it is all about in a few minutes. But let me say at this stage a few words on what I've seen develop over the last few months. The Geneva Policy Outlook has been a collaborative initiative that we have driven at the Institute with a triple vision: to generate critical debate and integrated perspective by nurturing and animating a diverse community, to connect science and academic debates with the concrete and the multiple challenges of our radically uncertain and dangerous world. And third, to produce actionable and forward-looking insights that can inform the types of courageous decisions that our world and its current challenges badly need. Let me underscore here how this project is completely aligned with the work that we've been doing over the last 2 years at the Institute. It inscribes itself in particular in continuity with the redefinition of our vision and mission and of the collective work that we did, mobilizing all our stakeholders to give ourselves a new charter. Let me quote here from that new charter, and let me tell you the way in which this charter affirms who we are. A pioneer in the exploration of global issues, the Geneva Graduate Institute opens creative spaces for diverse communities and fosters the understanding and engagement essential to a peaceful, equitable, and sustainable world. Said in other words, the Geneva Policy Outlook is really a direct application of this affirmation of our identity and role here at the Institute. As I mentioned already, this initiative has been from the start and all along, by construction, I would say, a partnership and a collaborative project. Hence, I would like to express today a number of thanks. The Geneva Policy Outlook is a partnership between the Swiss Confederation, the Republic and State of Geneva, the City of Geneva, the Fondation pour Genève, and the Institute. So let me here express my heartfelt thanks to all our partners who have also been actually very active contributors in the process and discussions that have taken place over several months. So big thank you to Olivier, who is here. Big thank you also to Jörg Lauber, Ambassador Lauber, who has really been a strong support of this project. Big thank you to Sami Kanan. Thank you to Marc Pictet, who is also very strongly been behind this project. And the thanks that I'm expressing today go to them personally, but also obviously to all their colleagues and their teams. Let me say also a big thank you to all contributors, and there have been many, and many are in the room, across the different dinners and meetings and moments that we've spent together. There have been many contributors. I cannot list all of you, but you know who you are. So big thank you to you, and particularly to those who have contributed pieces that you will be discovering very soon. Internally at the Institute, let me also express my most sincere thanks to Hakim van Man, who is, we can say that, the soul of this project, and to Lena Menge for all her energy on this project and on so many others, all the energy and work that both of you, Lena and Hakim, you've put into this initiative. Let me add here also my thanks to the team that has helped them at different stages of the project, to Gabrielle, sitting in the first row, who's played a very important role throughout, to Sveta Ramachandran, and to Dr. Xingyu Yan, who worked really, all three of them, above and beyond the call of duty. To Maëlys Gluck and Flavia Keller, who assured the language editing of the French and German versions, and to Besarta Castrati, who provided overall assistance. So here we are tonight with a process in place that has generated what I hope you will find to be a valuable output once you hear more from Hakim and some of the co-authors and once you have a chance to read the articles, which are, by the way, now accessible. My question then is, what next? And I have to admit that I have a dream. We have today in Geneva an exceptional opportunity. In fact, opportunity is maybe not the right word. I would actually think that duty is more like the right word. We have the duty to make use of the unique density of experiences, expertise, and knowledge that is present right here around us in order to come together and to actively shape the debate on the future that we want. When the noises around us are screaming war, we need to keep affirming and preparing for peace. When the zeitgeist is one of separation, re-enclosing, and conflict, we need to activate collaboration and cooperation and to demonstrate their power. When the solutions of yesterday have shown their limits, if they have not in fact led us to where we are today, we have to be creative, and creativity cannot happen without the existence of spaces and times for exploration, without active listening, co-learning, co-construction, even dreaming, in fact. When uncertainty, fear, if not despair, impose themselves, we have to regain and to retrain our individual and our collective courage. Geneva is the right place where these flames can be nurtured. Peace, obviously, collaboration, realist utopia, courage. All this, after all, makes up the spirit of Geneva and the urgency of retooling the spirit for the particular challenges of our world is now, to borrow here the powerful words of Martin Luther King. We need scientifically informed and solutions-oriented readings of our world, infused by a positive and not a dystopic vision of our future. A future where the well-being of humans and humus, the planet and the biodiversity on which we humans are dependent and on which we thrive, are reaffirmed as clear priorities. A future where we project again the fight for peace. Peace will never be perpetual, Pace Immanuel Kant, but the fight for it should be perpetual. A future where we move from logics of destruction and consumption to logics of regeneration and replenishing everywhere, in our economies, in our social and political spaces, but also in our personal lives. And a future where we have all equally, not only the right, but indeed the reality of access to all of this. We just simply cannot give up on our future. In the words of the early 20th century philosopher Simone Weil, the future does nothing for us, gives us nothing. It is we who build it, and to build it, we must give all to it, even our life. Naturally, we do not have to go that far, but precisely because of who we are, because of where we are here in Geneva, and we should think really not only of the physical, but also of the symbolic and the resource meaning of that location, of that notion, Geneva. We have the duty to pool our energies, our experiences, our knowledge, our expertise, to propose grounded but nevertheless utopian readings and solutions in order to activate and prepare the future that we want beyond the black clouds of our present. It is in exceptional periods that everything becomes possible, Jean Monnet said when he was building up Europe, which in the immediate aftermath of an horrendous war could really have been considered as a really crazy idea, a crazy utopia. And our current period is indeed, again, exceptional, that's for sure. I believe that strengthening the Geneva Policy Outlook in one form or another can be an important contribution in that direction. Carrying the voice of Geneva for the world and with the world, a voice that should reaffirm its own tone in spite, if not because, of the current violent and dissonant chorus. Let us talk also about that tonight and after in the coming days and weeks. Let me wish all of you a great evening, a great discovery of the Geneva Policy Outlook, and now I hand the word to Olivier. Thank you.
Monsieur le conseiller aux États, Madame la directrice, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and friends, wars, pandemics, weapons of mass destruction, cyber attacks, technological disruption, crisis, climate crisis, institutional crisis, multiple crises, existential threats, polarization, decline, urgency, radical uncertainty. These are some of the words that we have heard more and more loudly during the last few years. These are violent words. They could lead to paralysis or inaction. It is not an option, of course. And I think that today it's time to give room, without falling into angelism, to give room to a more optimistic and constructive discourse. Here in Geneva, we do have assets. We do not start from scratch. This year, we have a 160-year history. We can be proud of our achievements. We can be proud of our contributions to a rules-based world order. We can be proud of the millions of lives saved. We have also demonstrated that we can adapt. I'm thinking here about all the new institutions that we have hosted here in Geneva during the last 20 years. In the health sector in particular, but not only. In the more recent past, we have shown that we can also participate in innovative and impactful solutions. The Black Sea Grain Initiative is a good example in this respect. In addition, I feel also that there is an appetite to join this collective effort. One good indicator of it is the number of people working for International Geneva. If you add up all the staff working for the permanent missions, the NGOs, and the international organizations, we are close to 36,000. The figure has never been so high. And I think it's quite remarkable in this time of COVID and difficult budgetary situation for many donors. We cannot deny, however, that our world faces unprecedented challenges. The need for a better understanding, for clarity, for a compass to navigate uncharted waters has rarely been so pressing. Hence, the Geneva Policy Outlook. The Geneva Policy Outlook tells us what is going on, what is ahead, what works, and how. I see it as a practical guide for the 36,000 people making International Geneva, and beyond, for all the people involved in international cooperation activities. When Arin Venman and the Institute approached us with the idea a few months ago, we immediately said yes. I also would like to thank warmly all the people who have made today's outcome possible. I start with the group of senior international civil servants, diplomats, and academics who did participate in the discussions at the end of last year. They did provide the background for the Geneva Policy Outlook. They generously and candidly shared their expertise, their knowledge, and their views. The exchanges were rich and enlightening. Arim's skills to moderate them is not unrelated to it. Thank you also to the small and dynamic team at the Institute which organized everything. Thank you, of course, to all the people who wrote a piece for the Outlook. And finally, a special thank you to you, Arin, for launching the idea, but also for being able to implement it in record-breaking time. The Swiss Confederation, the State of Geneva, the City of Geneva, as well as the Fondation pour Genève, support Geneva Policy Outlook. They see it as a contribution to the International Geneva of the future. They wish it every success and long live. Thank you for your attention. Now I give the floor to you, Arim, for more explanation about the Geneva Policy Outlook.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good evening to you. As the editor of the Geneva Policy Outlook, allow me also to warmly welcome you here tonight to the launch of the Geneva Policy Outlook 2023. You have already heard from Marie-Laure and from Olivier some of the framings, but I still wanted to perhaps dig a little bit deeper to where the idea came from, just to set the scene. Now, just about a year ago, a friend of mine told me about a conversation during one of these diplomatic dinners that many of you know that happen all the time here in Geneva, where one diplomat apparently said, Putin will never bomb Kiev. And that dinner was just a day before the start of the war and before the first bombs hit Kiev. And this story for me had kind of a deeper meaning. It showed that we live in an era where the unimaginable can become reality quicker than we think. And that we better expand our imagination about what the future could hold and what we can do now to shape it in a way that the future becomes desirable. At that time, when the war started at the Institute, we were contacted by many of our members of our community that were asking for help to make sense of what was going on. There was a sense that something more systemic had changed, that we had reached a certain moment of cumulation. And how we responded was with a series of Chatham House meetings and also about reflections about how International Geneva could adapt to changing world orders. Already there, Olivier, a big thanks to you, who from the very early days supported these critical exchanges that form the foundation of what today is the Geneva Policy Outlook. Now, then, the roots of what you have in front of you here tonight is a shared feeling of urgency to scale and speed adaptation to change in times of radical uncertainty. Beyond the war in Ukraine, the consequences of climate change, environmental degradation, shifting demographics and geopolitics, and game-changing technological revolutions becoming all very real and are stretching our imagination. Had I known about ChatGPT before starting the Geneva Policy Outlook, oh my God, we would have been perhaps ready in a month, but it would have been a different product. This to say, the Geneva Policy Outlook has humanity inside. No ChatGPT. Now, but beyond all of these systemic changes we have out there, we have these changes in the global orders, which I frame in the Geneva Policy Outlook as described by Amitav Archayev as the multiplex world, which is an emerging era of a more fragmented global governance after the American century that is characterized by an ever-increasing diffusion of power between states and also between states, private sector, and societal actors. Now, it's within this confluence of systemic change and interchange of international order that we are positioning the global policy outlook and want to, with a reflection process about the quest for strategies of a global hub like International Geneva to deal with all these changes. Now, let me turn to the question, what is the Geneva Policy Outlook? It is a strategic analysis startup that harnesses forward-looking insights to promote cooperation and problem-solving on critical global governance issues, as has already been aligned by Marie-Laure and also by Olivier. The product we are launching here tonight is a new digital publication that places its finger on the pulse of Geneva's global policy space. It looks at upcoming strategic and operational trends relevant for professionals working in global affairs in Geneva and elsewhere. The contributions to the Geneva Policy Outlook have emerged organically from the collective reflection process that Olivier and Marie-Laure alluded to, that brought together so many of the professionals which are here in this room tonight. Now, in other words, it's a new website that features analysis on critical global governance issues written by great professionals and people. And since it's a website, let's have a look. This is it. And this is the moment where, not unlike in my classes where I say, don't take out your mobile phones, you can take out your mobile phones now. And Google Geneva Policy Outlook and have a look at everything which is in there. Now, the first element I would like to point you to is the logo. And you see these little red kind of thingies on the left and the right, which acts in fact like an image of a frame, because what this logo represents is that we aim to frame new ideas. It also is an image of a window through which we can discern perspective of what's ahead. And because we are living in the age of TikTok, you can also do this. And you can make the frame. And just by doing this, like these two little red edges at the end, perhaps everything is becoming clearer. And we haven't yet have a TikTok page yet for the Geneva Policy Outlook, but we live in the 21st century. Now, if we are now going a little bit further, and I can move this, in fact, here, you see this distinction between the issues and negotiations, which are the two basic distinctions by which we have ordered the contributions. Very, very broadly, these are on issues that require more attention globally and what they mean for international Geneva. And the second section looks ahead on specific negotiations or institutional reform processes that will take place in Geneva. And they also explain key issues at stake and the opportunities and risks involved. This is exactly the type of forward-looking analysis that Olivier was referring to, that is targeted at the people who work on these global issues here in Geneva, in whatever functions they have, but also those at Capital or in academies around the world who are working on global governance issues. Now, then what you see is in fact different languages. So you have the issues, the enjeux, die Themen, and die Negotiations, Négociation und Verhandlungen. We wanted to stay true to multilingualism. And since we are here in Switzerland, it's English, French, and German. On the one hand, French, because we are from Geneva, and we believe in the importance of connecting la Genève internationale et la Genève locale, but also la Romandie internationale, if one may say so, and also connect beyond the Röstigraben. Because fact is, Switzerland is pretty Germanic, even though sometimes in Geneva you don't really see that much. But it's not just important. French and German are also important languages at a European level, and whenever French and German actors go hand in hand, it's a pretty good step forward for Europe. Now, this has been a tremendous effort, and of course, translating the articles was important, and we found a great partner with Swiss linguists that helped us walking the walk for multilingualism. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we will delve into the substance with many of the authors who are here, but also I would like to just offer my personal thanks to, of course, the Swiss Confederation, the Republic and State of Geneva, the City of Geneva, the Fondation pour Genève, and the Graduate Institute. I think this is also a symbolic partnership because it unites the three levels of government with the private sector and academia into a real good offices for shaping the future of international Geneva. And my thanks go particular to Samer Yedis, to Vanessa Menge, to Gregory Licker, and to Olivier Couteau, all from these institutions. Of course, also Marie-Laure thanked the respective superiors, but I also thank those who worked on seeing this project come alive. Now, this would not have been possible without the team. And really, I think only a team that brings together the collective wits of India, China, Switzerland, and Brazil can do that. So thank you very much, Sweta, Jinju, Lena, and Gabrielle. Also, thank you, Maëlys, Flavia, and Berzata. Thank you so much. And I think it simply deserves a round of applause. Now, we'll have the opportunity to thank many of the participants in the exchanges here personally as we go on stage. My thanks to all of you who participated. But let us now delve, of course, into the various substantive elements which we have in the Geneva Policy Outlook. And I'd like to invite on stage Suri Moon, Manon Blanca-Ford, Dimitri, and Sonia, please. If you could just join us here. We want, and I'm going to change the microphone. One thing that was very important for the Geneva Policy Outlook is, in fact, to look at some ongoing multilateral negotiations that are happening in International Geneva. Now, we know that there is much more going on, but we pinpointed those that came out of our reflections as some of the ones which are really useful to look at. Now, and perhaps, Suri, we start with you on the pandemics treaty. We are just coming out of a global pandemic. States have come together to really want to tackle global collaboration on pandemics head on. A lot has happened last year, but what is your look ahead? What are the key things that one should be alerted to when we think of pandemics treaty negotiations 2023? Please, sorry.
Thanks very much, and let me also congratulate everyone involved in this ambitious project. Very exciting to be here with all of you and to see it come alive, to be reality. So we are hopefully at the end of this pandemic, but as many of you may have heard, WHO just decided that we are still in the middle of a public health emergency of international concern. So fingers crossed we can continue to do what we're doing today, coming together. And I wish that we had this event one day later, because tomorrow morning we're actually supposed to see the zero draft of the pandemic treaty will be released, and so we'll have a much clearer idea actually where we're heading. But in the absence of that extra bit of intelligence, maybe I can just flag a few things that I think are particularly notable about this process. And one, thinking back to Olivia, your comments about the rules-based order and Geneva's contribution to a rules-based international order. I think what we see with the pandemic treaty negotiations is precisely that ambition. And that global health in Geneva used to be very much about technical experts. It used to be about money and development assistance. But after the greatest shared crisis that we've been through in a century as an international community, I think it's very telling that here in Geneva, it's very, very, this is really the place where the rules for how the world will better prepare and respond to future pandemics are being negotiated. And I was in a mission breakfast just a few days ago where a senior official from WHO called the fact that we are in the middle of a pandemic treaty negotiation magical. And I think we have to recognize this. It is magical because there are many things militating against us reaching the kind of international agreement that we need to actually effectively prevent and better respond to future pandemics. I think inequality between countries and missions is a big issue. I think mistrust on the part of the public on expert governance on what's happening in places like Geneva is a big issue. I think geopolitical tensions are a big issue. I mean, these are all themes that I've flagged in the article, but it's quite inspiring to see that we're making progress, we've made progress, and in 2023, we have to make progress because the goal and the agreement is that we will finish this by May of 2024. I think one of the big challenges that we face in getting there by May of 2024 is, of course, the usual political divisions between countries, between non-state actors, but also that we have not one, but in fact two pandemic treaties, in some ways, being negotiated in parallel, because next to the negotiations to create a brand new pandemic treaty are ongoing negotiations to amend a pre-existing set of international regulations that were supposed to prepare the world, that were supposed to help us deal with cross-border infectious disease threats. And of course, clearly we're not adequate in light of the COVID crisis. Having a two-track parallel negotiating process is hard for any diplomat. It's difficult even for the biggest, wealthiest countries, with all of the technical experts and armies of lawyers. It's especially difficult, we know, for the smaller missions, and it's very difficult for health people, because health people are used to data, and we're used to microscopes, and we're used to pathogens. We are not used to laws and treaties. This is not something that has typically been part of global health governance. It's big in trade and security and environment and human rights. Treaties are a normal instrument. This is not at all the norm in the health field, where we relied very, very heavily actually on informal agreements for the last 50, 60, 70 years. So it's a big challenge, I think, for the health community, but I want to embrace the optimism that I heard the other day. I think it's a magical moment. I think we will make big progress in 2023, but I think some of the power inequalities that we see will be a major hill to climb.
So, sorry, in a nutshell, pandemic treaty negotiation is surely a negotiation in International Geneva to watch. There will be a lot going on. Many governments are also expanding their capacities to negotiate and to analyze. So that's the first issue really to watch out there. And I already know that one topic that will be back in the Geneva Policy Outlook 2024. I'm sure about that. And I'm also sure disarmament issues are going to be in the next issue. We have Manon, who is here with us from the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research. And you've been following the negotiations on the biological weapons treaty. So what's cooking there? I hope nothing too bad.
Thank you, Hakim, for the invitation, and congratulations on the launch for the Geneva Policy Outlook. I'm very pleased to be here and to meet all of you. So regarding pandemics, I would say we might need to be cautious about linking pandemics to biological weapons, but we could say that although it was a very challenging year for disarmament diplomacy regarding the outcomes of the 10th review conference of the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation on Nuclear Weapons, which was unable to secure consensus. The Biological Weapons Convention, its 9th review conference that we monitored with my colleague James Reville, who also co-authored our contribution, was able to secure a consensus with modest outcomes. We could say that what is particularly interesting regarding pandemics is the fact that state parties managed to secure a view in the final report to develop two mechanisms. The first one is about facilitating international cooperation and assistance, and which is particularly interesting regarding the fact that we faced several international challenges to international cooperation in the field of medical countermeasures. But also the second one was a view to establish a mechanism on science and technology, which was also interesting in the BWC discussions because there was some thoughts about using technology to monitor disease, for instance, and there was also a lot of talks about setting guidelines to regulate dual-use biological research as well. So now I believe it's to the international community that is also here in Geneva to make the most of these views and try to engage as much as possible in regulating those issues.
Thank you, and thank you for highlighting this notion of dual-use research. We'll come to this also as we're speaking about this, of course, the challenges of these new technological revolutions, which of course are also very important in the field of biotech. And of course there are dual-use applications. And the kind of scenarios which are out there, what these dual-use technologies can do, really require a much closer look and how they can be regulated. So it's very good to know that this is a thing to watch, I think, in addition to all of the other things you do, and simply to note that there are very classical conventions out there whose project is ongoing, and that states have committed to. So thank you for giving us an insight on this. Now, Sonia, we're going to the environmental field. When we contacted on your contribution, you said, "Look, I'm in Montreal. I'm in the middle of the biodiversity convention negotiations. Now, these just finished. What's coming next?"
So, right. Thank you for inviting me, first of all, and thank you everyone for coming tonight. Where are we right now with the negotiations and the end of those negotiations and the start of a new phase, let's say, after the agreement back in Montreal at the end of December last year of a global biodiversity framework. It's called the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework now. After more than almost 4 years of discussions and very contentious negotiations among the parties of the convention and the participation of many observers and stakeholders in those negotiations. What was the pressing issue? The pressing issue is the urgency to act because of the imminent destruction of the environment, of the loss of biodiversity, and the impacts of climate change, and that created a process that was called for by the parties of the Convention on Biological Diversity back in 2018 to start a process to come up with an agreement to action on that biodiversity loss, to do something about it. So that concluded in Montreal successfully. Some of us were doubting at one point of the negotiations whether or not we were going to get there, because precisely those negotiations were quite tense at moments. We could see the now common in a sense divisions between so-called north and south in terms of the ambition. So the north calling for more ambitious targets and goals to protect biodiversity, to counter the effects of degradation, et cetera, and on the other side, developing countries saying, yes, all good with that ambition, but we need support and we need the resources and we need capacity to go ahead and action on those ambitious goals and targets. So after all those hesitations and challenging moments, we got to the adoption of that agreement. It's not perfect, but it's a balanced compromise, and I think we can work with that, with those 23 targets, 4 global goals to get us to the next steps. And those next steps start now in 2023 with the implementation and the translation of those global goals, global targets into the national level goals and targets, but also action plans, right? How do we get to move forward on implementing those goals and targets? And so that's what's starting right now in 2023. All the different governments, actors, sectors are looking into, okay, what does that mean, what we adopted in Montreal, and how do we translate that into concrete action? And something that I brought forward in my article is precisely that now that we move into that next phase of implementation, we need at least 2 conditions to materialize. And one is on the side of securing sufficient, accessible, sufficient financial resources to precisely go into supporting countries and different actors to really translate those goals and targets into concrete action. And the other one is the issue that Geneva is very much good at, and it's bringing everyone to the table, and not the table of negotiations, but the table of implementation, of rolling out those targets through partnerships, through alliances, through bringing different sectors to, chip in and contribute to the implementation of those goals and targets. And so I highlight some of that in the article that I invite you to read if you want to know more. So yeah, I think that we're in that stage where translation of that agreement comes into play and has to translate into something more concrete, because the urgency keeps on being there.
And thank you for highlighting, of course, that notion that of course, states negotiate, but then the implementation is for many, many different actors, and for the role of Geneva in facilitating that. Now, a similar argument I've seen in your article, Dimitri, about reforming the reform narrative about the WTO, where the question mark was also, well, do other actors other than states have something to say? This is one of the many questions you looked at when reflecting on the upcoming reform process of the WTO as one of the other issues to watch.
I should warn everyone from the start, the first draft I submitted for this article was about 6,000 words too long, so Akim may have to drag me off this stage, but I'll try to be concise. What I try to do in the article is basically two things, and just some ways to look at the reform process and more concretely practice what I think Marie-Laure described far better than I did as realistic utopianism. So what is actually happening and what is the best thing we could hope for to happen? The WTO Ministerial Conference, which has finished, saw members agree for the first time truly to officially begin a reform process. For me, this mostly reminded me of how the easiest thing in the world to do is to convince my friends we should go to a restaurant for dinner, but any attempt to choose a specific restaurant leaves with all of us eating reheated leftovers at home. The reform process is very, very similar in that way. Ministers have, in a lot of ways, I think, attempted to paper over fundamental disagreements about the way international trade should work and should be regulated and the rules that should govern it, and even the advisability of rules themselves, with a generic call to reform a multilateral organization. And that does raise fascinating questions. Why is there no role at all for civil society within the formal processes of the WTO? Hell, let's get neoliberal about this. Why is there no role for business? Businesses are the ones who trade, and yet you can't invite Google to a meeting on e-commerce. You can't invite Amazon. They can't even be in the room. So it does raise those fundamental questions, and that is an important conversation. But in watching the reform process, the far more, I think, pertinent question is, have members accepted that the world has changed? That the consensus that existed a decade ago among the major players, that for better or worse, and there are, I'm sure, 1,000 different views on whether it was for better or for worse, dictated that whatever else happens, trade should flow. Trade should be predictable, trade should be politics blind. You should simply be able to source the best value product from wherever you deem it accessible. You should be able to construct supply chains that span the world. And if the politicians are arguing back and forth, that is one thing. Politics and commerce will be divided by the water's edge. Talk about realistic utopianism that leans on the utopianistic side. And I think that is very much fraying, if not broken. So the question is, what is the role that members and governments see for the WTO? Is it in trying to maintain that order? Is it in trying to enforce that order? To use international law and the force of international persuasion to keep that regime as intact as governments will let the institution keep it and let one another keep it? Or is there a transformation? Is it an admission that parts of this order will fray and that the organization can play a different role in exchanging ideas, in sharing how we can accommodate one another's sensitivities, in deciding which of the rules still work and which don't? The reform process challenges members to ask those questions that, you know, I'm on a stage talking about WTO reform next to disarmament, health. I recognize these are not, you know, WTO reform doesn't sound like the most important thing in the world, and indeed it's not. I think Kim may have invited me up here by mistake. But trade does matter to all of these things. And there is no way we tackle climate change, there is no way we tackle pandemics, there is no way we even tackle security without a trade component. And the question of what does the role of the WTO and indeed international collaboration around trade work, how does that contribute, is a really important one to follow.
So the great thing, to cut you off, Dimitri, is that I can just say, read his article, and there's much more. So thank you very much to all four of you for giving us these pointers. I'd now like to invite our next colleagues to come on stage, please. The first round of applause for you. If I could, Gabriel, Peter, Jérôme, and Balthazar, if you could just kindly come on stage. And I think that I just going to bridge the notion what Dimitri have left us with, that of course there is all this connectedness between these topics. No? And that is, I think, also the ambition of the Geneva Policy Outlook, that one takes the negotiations that are still very much shaped by silo dynamics and looks at them connected to some of the negotiations in other settings. And I think this facilitation of connectedness is something very important as International Geneva goes forward, to see where there is opportunity to facilitate the adaptation to ever more integrated policy processes. Now, we also saw in the first line of articles that there is something about the traditional topics of Geneva, no? Associated to very established organizations and very established already processes. But there's also another way of working in Geneva, which is much more associated to discrete diplomacy, or let's call it a new diplomacy that is not shaped by formal multilateral negotiations between states. And I think there I'd like to start with you, Peter, with your work at the World Council of Churches and what you shared with respect to possibilities of ecumenical relationships in the case of Ukraine.
Well, thank you very much, Achim. I guess that this probably wouldn't be the best moment to mention my early adoption of ChatGPT and thereby to raise unnecessary concerns about the actual authorship of my contribution. But let me congratulate you and the Institute and all the contributors and the sponsors of this publication, which I think actually does an excellent job in presenting a snapshot of the diversity of issues and actors in International Geneva. So well done and congratulations. So yes, my contribution is about reflecting upon our particular angle on the way in which the world has indeed changed. And all of our previous assumptions that have persisted for a generation or more have been fundamentally shaken by what is happening in Ukraine. That's also true in the ecumenical movement, because within the membership of the WCC, the Russian Orthodox Church is one of our larger member churches. But we also have constituency in Ukraine. And so how do we deal with a situation where all of our previous assumptions, theological assumptions, developed since the end of the Second World War, have presumed a consensus about the role of Christians as peacemakers? How do we reconcile that with what we hear from the mouth of the leadership of our own member church in Russia, that to any logical assessment seems to give justification even to celebrate a holy war? How do we reconcile those things? So this calls for a very deep dialogue at a theological level, you could say, among the membership, but which has also immediate geopolitical consequences in a context where the religious leadership and the religious constituency in these contexts is also so close to power, but also so much implicated in the consequences of the war. In addition, in our reflection, what we realized is that we actually have a precious asset within the ecumenical movement in terms of a bridge for dialogue in a context where many other opportunities for dialogue are, per force, being closed off. How do we make use of this asset whereby we can hopefully create a dialogue that creates an opportunity for mutual understanding, potentially, ultimately, for peace building and reconciliation? This process is not over, but my article gives you a little insight into the very intense struggle that has gone on within our membership and its interconnections with the political reality that we're all challenged by today. The story is not yet told. It is an ongoing process, and it remains a very difficult and sensitive one. But I'm looking forward to the relationships that we've built in this process through the evening dialogues and through this publication to build collaborations and to offer the assets that we have to other actors in International Geneva. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think also just the network which you represent, I think you can just highlight it, how many million people you reach. I think you mentioned this incredible number.
Yeah, so our membership, we have, I think, 350 member churches, thereabouts, in 140 countries, and a total global constituency of 580 million people.
So that is a type of connectedness and relationships that can be reached via Geneva. And that is also part of the critical ingredients of what in this town is called private diplomacy. No? Accessing networks wherever one has leverage. And this has also led, Gabriel, you to your analysis of earth diplomacy. This fundamental heritage of private diplomacy in Geneva, earth diplomacy as an instrument to accelerate action on climate change.
You just stole my elevator pitch right there. I have nothing else to say.
Well, the elevator is much longer.
Let's just consider that it's a skyscraper, so we have a little bit more time. Actually, we don't, but let's just pretend that we do. So essentially, if we look at climate negotiations now, multilateralism and multilateral negotiations are doing whatever they are equipped to do, which is to try and tailor international agreements that have to fit in within the intentions and the strategies of almost 200 partners and members, which can be quite difficult. So how actually can we implement credible, feasible, and urgent climate action beyond these negotiations in the multilateral system? This is what led to the thinking of what diplomacy is and what earth diplomacy should do. So essentially, the message here for earth diplomacy is very clear, is one that we have to shift discussions from trying to reach an agreement that needs to fit within 200 parties, and how can we land climate solutions and projects on the ground. So from words into action. As you probably know and are very, very, very aware at this point, climate action is actually riddled with several different problems and conflicts. There are conflicts of interest between corporations, between private individuals who have their little stake into the climate discussion. And there is, of course, geopolitical competition, which is a big part of it. And going around geopolitical competition on climate issues is extremely difficult, mainly when these geopolitical competitions are fueled by fossil fuels. And I think it's always good for us to remember that fossil fuels are not only a source of energy, but they're a source of power. So going around them and finding agreements, it's very difficult. But then there is another group of people working on equally hard issues with equally hard negotiators, which is the peace mediation field. And what are they doing? And what's very successful in this very city is precisely the application of private diplomacy, which is the discrete type of diplomacy conducted by non-state and non-international organization actors to create alternative pathways to find solutions whenever these official pathways are blocked, such as now in the UNFCCC. So why then, and one of the examples that we can give of a success of private diplomacy is the Black Sea grain deal that Olivier mentioned in his opening, which was essentially tailored by the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue using private diplomacy. And then the big question is, okay, so if we see that this is already working for something that is immensely complex, why can't we then apply this to unlock pathways for climate action? And this is Earth diplomacy. What should be mentioned, however, is that private diplomacy and this discrete type of diplomacy cannot substitute the official tracks and climate agreements. I think climate agreements, they basically set the bar of what the international community should do, but private diplomacy can unlock and accelerate the whole process. So if at this time you're already thinking, okay, what am I going to have for dinner? Let's just remember one thing, which is that Earth diplomacy is, and this is the bottom line, Earth diplomacy is the application of private diplomacy to remove urgent obstacles to climate action. So shifting discussions from the climate negotiations at the international level and focusing on acting on urgent climate solutions. This is it.
Thank you. And also in your article, you make a great pitch for perceiving Geneva not just as a place for multilateral negotiations, but simply for very practical problem solving. And that is, I think, a very important message to take away here as well. And problem solving is also an issue, Balthazar, that you will know, because you're working on cybersecurity threats at the ICRC and are a very long-term observer of what cybersecurity has meant for the humanitarian sector. You have dedicated your piece to that, and there's a lot of problem solving to be done, I'm sure.
Thank you, Achim, and I would like to echo my fellow speakers just by congratulating you and all concerned for this product, for this interesting outlook, and I was very proud and happy to contribute to it. My article talks about the fact that the International Committee of the Red Cross suffered quite a massive cyber breach, a data breach, early 2022, and that really shook us to the core. But I talked briefly about the complexity of responding to such a crisis. But I think even perhaps more important is to think that each crisis also offers an opportunity. And what does that actually mean to us collectively, I would sort of say, because it is clearly a tendency that cyber attacks will be on the increase and will concern more and more sectors, and clearly also humanitarian organizations whose access often depends on the trust people place in organizations and their capacity to have a safe cyber environment. And in this sense, I make the point that the choice of technology, the management of data, cannot be purely approached from a technological point of view, but is essentially also a highly political affair. It's really managing a humanitarian organization, namely the ones who work in war zones such as mine, needs to think very carefully, what does it actually mean to be also a principled humanitarian organization in the cyberspace? It's a new dimension that is added. What does it take to really realize the sort of features that humanitarian action must stand for? And these are very complex and difficult trade-offs to organize our footprint in the cyberspace, to also ask ourselves what kind of groups and people should we talk to. I think the ICRC has build the muscle and learned how, for instance, 20, 30 years ago to be in dialogue with non-state armed groups, with jihadi groups. We are in dialogue with nearly 500 armed groups around the world currently of all different denominations in order to secure access and deliver on a humanitarian mandate. But it is also the question of how will we interact probably tomorrow with hacker groups? How can we secure that they respect humanitarian action as we must secure respect for humanitarian action by all sorts of gangs, political criminals, state actors, non-state actors? It's quite a large range of actors that we have to convince, that we cannot force, but that we have to convince that our work is important. And that means that beyond the institutional thinking on how we go about that has all sorts of legal, policy, and operational implications that we have to think holistically. The whole humanitarian sector probably has to come together and really ask itself, what does it mean for the humanitarian sector? One policy, talking about policy requests that we really, as the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement want to put forward, is really the kind of sanctity of humanitarian data. Humanitarian data, people in trust to humanitarian actors, must never ever be used against them. Now, that may sound sort of a naive wish, but I think it's part of the acceptance of humanitarian work to also see that the personal data of people must never be used against them. In my article, I try to formulate a couple of personal ideas on how also Geneva and Switzerland, which is traditionally, of course, extremely supportive of humanitarian action and the key hub in the world for humanitarian action, can contribute and reinforce that quest for as safe as possible cybersecurity environment for humanitarian actors. There are issues that humanitarian organizations can deal with themselves, but there are also important roles to be played by states, by authorities, by research actors, by private actors, and I try to give a couple of modest avenues and hope that Geneva will play an important role in moving us forward in an as safe as possible world where humanitarian action can continue to have its impact in a world that is digitally very much disrupted and changed. And I hope I raised a little bit your appetite, and thank you for having come tonight.
Thank you so much. And of course, this brings us into a very important topic that has become more and more crucial for the city, this kind of adaptation to new technological changes, which the humanitarian sector has been so imposed to. Here, Jérôme, you're the director of the digital hub at the Graduate Institute, and you've been tackling with not just the problem of the humanitarian sector, but the issue at large. And you wrote a piece on techno or beyond techno solutionism. Now, can you unpack what the bigger picture behind this is?
In French or in English?
C'est comme tu veux. Huh?
All right, so I'll continue in English, as my colleagues did so brilliantly. I think we've had a very comprehensive picture tonight of the year ahead, which may consist of a year of uncertainty, or to quote Marie-Laure, a year of radical uncertainty, or an era of radical uncertainty. And what do you do in a time of uncertainty, or facing uncertainty? You look for quick fix, you look for solutions, especially if you are engaged in the policy-making cycle or in a political cycle. So what do? Well, either you turn to fake news, disinformation, populist slogans and reactionary politics, and you turn to technologies. And very often we realize that technology is perceived as a quick fix. There is even a demand of populations to have their public action digitalized, to have it online, and for politicians as well. Very often the idea is, well, we'll put a platform in place, and it will solve the problem of democratic participation. And of course, it's not the case. It's not the case because we never know in advance what the impact of a technology will be. The impact is always highly contextualized. It depends on the social, cultural, political, economic situation and context. And it changes over time. And we've seen that with online platforms. We've seen that these platforms grew at a time where the regulatory framework was very limited, if not inexistent. And the impact of these platforms was very diverse in different countries and different times. So the danger for me of techno-solutionism, meaning turning to technology for a quick fix or as a quick fix, is primarily that actually we don't see the opportunities and the real potentials of technologies to solve some issues of the international level. And we have technologies that help us already today. Think of AI for negotiation, or helps negotiation, or to build scenarios, to prepare, to do some predictions. But once again, and several of you mentioned ChatGPT. ChatGPT can be very helpful in some cases, but we need to know what it is good for. And so there is always the need to have this kind of critical perspective or critical eye to the technology, understanding the technology, but also understanding its limits and our role, us as users, as the agents of change, not the technology, but us. This is actually a very important element. And that's exactly what we're trying to do at the Institute with students, with research, with our partners as well. We're trying to convey this vision and this view and this understanding of technology, whether it's older or more traditional technology of international relations, or it's more recent, more emergent technologies. My colleagues mentioned Manon earlier on biotech, synthetic biology, AI, quantum technology, my colleague of JESDA, all these emergent technologies that require us to look at them with a critical eye to both benefit from all the opportunities, but also to prevent, mitigate their impact. And that means what, and I'll finish with this, to ask ourselves three questions when we develop a technology. Who benefits from it, who's harmed by it, and who's involved in the development of that technology? And that implies to actually, within the design of the technology and the development of the technology, to make sure that we have the values and the principles that are at heart in Geneva. So values of peace, principles of peace, etc. And that implies to have kind of a peace by design, as we have a project with Achim and the EPFL, or human rights by design. So to make sure that in the design of the technology, from the inception, we have already these principles and norms. Thank you.
So thank you very much. Please stay on stage just for a little bit more as we conclude. And I just want to highlight perhaps one or two things. Now you may wonder, this is all very complex and this is kind of disjointed and one thing after the next to the other. That doesn't make sense to me. This is exactly it. And for a university professor, this is perfect to say that way. But the complexity, and this is kind of my after the editing process for the last couple of months, the complexity of issues, negotiations, and expertise that International Geneva has available is really the new capital of International Geneva that forges its relevance for the future. Why is this it? Because if you need to reassemble new solutions across sectors, institutions, topics, situations, locations, etc., you need to have that ability to learn, understand, and connect and reconnect and develop anew. And exactly, this is what Geneva can have a very important role as. But this only works if Geneva stays connected to the rest of the world, that it doesn't stay a bubble for itself, that it is connected to the new places of global governance, that it is connected to Addis, to many other zones in Africa and Asia, in Latin America and elsewhere, that it is connected to the so-called P5 dynamics, to the big superpowers, the emerging powers. So this degree of connectedness of different level, the ability to reconnect and connect, that is the management of this in what we in Geneva parlance we call now on the platforms, these many platforms that exist. That is really a very important asset for Geneva going forward. And ultimately also what I came away with, Geneva only works if it stays global. Because Geneva is a global city and it shouldn't just become another city in the global north. In the way that Europe is right now, this globality and shaping this globality in a voice to inform what is happening on Europe strategically, that is, I think, very important. So moderating the complexity, making sure Geneva stays connected, and reinforcing the identity of Geneva as a global hub. This is, I think, all of what the Geneva Policy Outlook would like to nurture and support. And I hope we have whet your appetite to dig deeper in many of the other articles which are there. Please do read in the language that you feel most comfortable. And if you want other languages, let's make it so. No? But before concluding, I would like to give the word to Sweta, who's been involved also from the very first moment of the development of the Geneva Policy Outlook, and to hear a few words from you, Sweta.
Thank you so much. I realize we're running 15 minutes over time, but the event was also planned keeping in mind a realistic utopian idea, so we hope that you're able to stay with us for that. But I did want to say that a lot of the topics that we discussed today might feel rather overwhelming, perhaps even a little bit bleak, and maybe a little bit impersonal as well. But for a lot of us here, these topics remain and continue to remain rather personal. These may be issues that we're working on day in and day out. Or perhaps these are just issues which may have impacted us professionally or personally. So for me personally, as someone who was a part of this journey, right from the start of the publication to where we are until now, I think two specific things stood out. First being the intersectional approach that we discussed, which is that a lot of these themes and topics seem to cut across each other in very obvious and not very obvious ways. And I think that became even more apparent as we were listening to all of the introductions through the authors today. And the second, that there's almost a feeling that we're at some form of tipping point, especially for certain domains, and it's more of a mindset of it's now or never, especially when it comes to critical issues such as building a culture of trust and courage, working on the pandemics treaty, for instance, on biodiversity, for example, and so on. So as a PhD researcher personally who moved to Geneva wanting to immerse myself into this insider's world of policymaking, I think this experience gave me a lot of that, and I really hope that we will all continue to engage in our capacity moving forward in whatever way possible. I would also like to make a very special mention of Ahim here, who has been curating this process right from the start. And I think one point as I wanted to highlight right as we wrap up is I think Ahim made it quite clear right from the start that positions and titles aren't really as critical as the human relationships are. And I think that's kind of the approach that we took to the publication as well, to hopefully approaching the authors that way and through the publications and the content that you see. So hopefully we can continue to form some of those relationships through the evening as we continue, and hopefully that will continue to be the core of the GPO itself. So with that, I know the call to action that we discussed today might be a bit overwhelming, but in terms of the tangible call to action, we really request all of you to visit our website, engage with it, and as we mentioned, this is very much a startup, so your feedback is very much appreciated, and hopefully we will be able to incorporate all of that for the upcoming editions. So lastly, we'd like to invite you to a cocktail reception following this launch, which is generously being offered by the Swiss Confederation, the Republic and State of Geneva, and the City of Geneva. So with that, I will hand it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sveta. And we did not have an elaborate Q&A session or reaching out to all of your knowledge. We know that. We want to be very realistic in the utopia. But we do have now this moment to interact more informally, and let's keep the conversation going in this way. So thank you very much for all of your presence here today. And let's, I think the reception is just a flow up. Thank you so much. Thank you to all the writers, speakers, and participants.